This time we want to do some velocity sculpting with box 2 and one box 3 data operator, and what we want to do is something like that. So this is a rock exploding, something like that, and if you scrub through and look carefully, this line here, this is another see-through piece of geometry that controls and sculpts the velocities of this explosion. If I scrub through here frame by frame, you can see that the chunks fly faster and further in that direction, in this direction, and in the direction facing us. And that is for a reason. They measure the distance and normal alignment of the velocity sculpting object, and those are applied as force to then explode this rock. And this is what we want to build today. It's all based on an idea that Crystal here had. It has vfx.com blog. It's a thinking particles tutorial about velocity sculpting, and this is what we're going to do today. But we're going to use PFlow Toolbox 2 and 3 namely. So it's a two-step tutorial. In the first step, we want to create our rock. I just created a juice wheel here and put it flat on the floor, and we want to use the new RayFire Fragmenter modifier. Very exciting thing. And we're going to use that to fragment our sphere. I hit fragment to have a viewport representation of what I'm doing. I can just scrub through here to add fragmentation, and it's all multi-threaded. And this is what we're going to use. It's a very cool new modifier shipped with the latest installment of RayFire, and what we want to use is the uniform fragmentation tab is fine. Probably want to use like 30. See how around that looks pretty good. And what you can do too is in this new modifier is that you can create gaps. You know, when we work in physx and with box 2, we get PhysXplosion sometimes because the collision geometry that's created by the physics engine is overlapping, and then it tries to avoid overlapping and tries to separate those pieces, which then is the notorious PhysXplosion, which you don't want if you're not doing explosion. Luckily, we do explosions here in this tutorial, but it's still undesired to have. So with having that gap, you can kind of prevent overlapping faces. You want that minimally not overlapping, to not have faces sticking into each other. Another cool thing, by the way, is see how this creates a shrink in volume here. If you check bridge holds, this creates a hollow shape, and it can be used for all kinds of cool stuff. You just drop a shell on there, and then you have a cool hollow shape, and you model yourself a nice random shell thing here that you can then use for all kinds of like crazy stuff, like if you use it for modeling, for example. And it's very responsive. It's all happening in real time. I just drag the spinners here on how I want my rings and stuff. But we want to create a rock, so we go back to uniform, and we don't want to bridge gaps. We want solids, and we don't need that either. And we need less chunks to start with, 50. And we can get rid of the shell. We don't need that. By the way, what's pretty cool is that since it's a modifier, you can stack it. Like if we want, let's say, kind of 50 total, we can do 20 here. Just add another RayFire Fragmenter on top, and hit fragment again, and use a different poly count. And now you have the two fragmenters on top of each other, and that way you can create some really cool fragment shapes, not just for PFlow, for thinking particles, or for any other rigid body engine you want. Bullet is coming to RayFire soon. And by the way, those green dots are the representations of the dots where it fractures along. If I filter the point cloud, it kills the ones around the sphere, and if I highlight the outer points, they get yellow where those stay blue. It's kind of hard to see here, but trust me, they do, to show off the ones that are not inside geometry, so they won't do anything. So if you hit filter cloud, they're not being considered for fragmentation. And that way you can create pretty cool fragmentation shapes. We just need one fragment modifier, and we want to set that to like 50 is good. And filter the cloud and play a little with the seed maybe. We have something desirable. Big chunks, small chunks, so we have a good variety. I think I can live. Let's use that one just for the heck of it. So we want to preserve the original shape that has the modifier still on it in case we need to change something. And then we want to detach it all. I hit that, and now I have all my fragments here as separated pieces. I can hide this now. Let's call that geo_original. Now I can hide that, and now I have all my fragments here. They're all separated, and they already have, by default, a different material ID on the outside. Oops, rotated that one. On the outside versus the inside. So you can totally spawn particles of the crack side material ID or texture differently on the inside, which we're going to do ultimately. I already made a rock multi-sub here with a crack edge and an outer rock material. So this is your new RayFire Fragmenter modifier that can be used for lots of cool shit. It's actually free if you even install the demo of Krakatoa, of RayFire, and the demo runs out. This modifier will still be fully functional, so that's like a freebie as of now if you have RayFire, so enjoy it. And we want to attach all those guys together, and we're going to do that now here. Attach list and take all our frags, not the ground, and then we want to reset all its X forms. So let's see. Yep, every fragment now has its pivot and its center. This is what we need for box 2 to function. Otherwise, they'll all have their pivot in the center point of the sphere, where the old geosphere had its pivot point, and then it's gonna create weird rotation and spins and the like. We can call it geosphere_frag now, and we want to make that a little more fancy. This is a shape that will not cause physx_explosion because it's all like a Voronoi pattern, which we know works pretty well, but we want to pimp that up just a little, and I want to use tessellate to give it more tessellation, and then we get those crack edges that are kind of cool. We can do 2 iterations. We just call for it a bit, and we want to give it a little less tension to have less overlapping here. If you want to check the crack edges here, default is 25. Those will overlap. That will cause bad things later in the simulation. And then we drop a noise on top, and we need a scale of 10 maybe. It's good. Something smaller. Just want to give it a little wavy surface, something like that, so it looks more, rocky. Let's see here, 10. I like 10 a little better even. And then we can play here with the size. Kind of like 10, so it's a little like super rocky. And this is what we're going to pipe into particle flow. Let's dump our material on there, and if we go into back into the edit poly here and just grab one of the elements and pull it out, it has a different material on the inside and the outside. So our material, multi-sub material, will totally take care of cool crack sides and the like. What we want to do now is start our particle flow. So we create a physics flow, but we want to write out dump the birth grid, because we already have geometry. We need a birth group in that case, and we can dump cube 2. We do that in a sec, and hit update and height, and now we have all our cubes here sitting. We don't need the cube. We already have shapes in our birth group. So there we go. And we don't really need spin either. We can delete that, and we can set that to convex so we get a closer representation of how our crack shapes gonna be represented in physx. If you check wireframe here, and you'll see that it's a pretty irregular and super big shape representation. So if I scrub that, I'll definitely get PhysXplosion. And right now it's just one big piece of rock because I didn't check that I want object elements to be used in my birth group, which I of course want to do. Let's go back into the birth group here and check object elements and update again. Now every fragment that I fragmented and then attached together will be a particle. So now if we scrub through here, we get PhysXplosion galore, because this representation here is still pretty inaccurate. We have all those little dips inside the rock from the noise modifier and the tessellation, where the physx shape just created a plane shape. So we want that to act a little more accurate, and in order to that, we need to play with our Weld Threshold here and our scale margin. Those two are designed to make the physx shape bigger than the actual shape. We want the opposite. We want to have that smaller. Let's try 1, and you can see how now it shrinks kind of inside the physx shape, so it'll penetrate through the floor or collision objects of themselves a little bit more, but by the same token I get rid of some of the nasty like dips here that are still flat as physx sees the shape. And let's go bold here. Let's do 4, and let's try that. A lot less PhysXplosion and nice inside materials, but still not totally happy. It's all jumpy and whatnot. Let's do 5. So see, all of the physx shape is now inside our actual geometry. They still react pretty decent. That's still a pretty good collision detection, although the shape is now visibly inside our fragments. But I mean, explosions are have the beauty that they are pretty fast. Stuff flies around pretty fast, so that'll totally still work for explosions. So we took care of our weld threshold. Another thing we want to lower just a little is our friction, maybe, and we want to up our shape tolerance to 0.1. So even if there's more penetration, they allow it to penetrate just a little. See, this guy's poking into the ground just a bit, but overall I can live with that. This is a lot less PhysXplosion. It's barely any, actually. They're just falling straight down. There's no PhysXplosion happening anymore, and the rigid bodies are still fairly intact. This one is sinking a little into the floor, but that's the only one I can see right now that does not react naturally as it would have. It's a real shape collision behavior. That's the other beauty about physx, is your particle flow does not care how many pulleys this thing has, because physx creates its own collision shapes. This is what physx sees. Super low poly placed in real time on even notebooks, and you can have the crappiest geometry with open edges, overlapping faces and whatnots in your birth group. Your simulation will still work just fine, because it creates its own geometry just for collisions and the dynamics. And in the next step, we want to create our shape that's going to control the velocity sculpting, which is going to be just another sphere, which we're going to deform with FFDs and whatnots, whatever you can think of how you can deform your sphere. That's what we're going to use to sculpt our velocities, and then we're going to create a box 3 operator above the physx shape that's going to control the mass of the particles, its angular velocity, and that's all going to be based on how far the particles are away from their sculpting shape. So let's build our juicer real quick and turn the particle system off and unhide our juicer frag here. We can still keep all those modifiers intact. Let's see what we got here. 40 is probably good, and we want that to be all the way around our collision shape. Center that. 20 is probably good because that'd be the perfect center around it. Oh, 20 of course. That's good. And then we can modify that with all kinds of FFDs. But this is the shape we're going to need. Geosphere underscore velo sculpting. And this is what we're going to use in our box 3 operator to sculpt velocities, just like in the preview here, where they fly faster and more violent into the directions where our velocity sculpting geo has a peak. So I turn my PFlow back on and hide my original shapes right after I did hide my juice where we're going to pick in a bit. There we go. And we create a data operator, which we find right here, or right click append operator, and we're going to call that rename, oh, not delete, but rename velo sculpting. And the first thing we want to do in our operator is we want to have every particle here that is a shape have its mass based on its shape. So bigger pieces won't fly that far or that high or whatever, and smaller pieces are going to fling off because they're a lot lighter. And that's very easy to do because naturally they all right now have a density, a mass by density of 1. We want to do that from mass channel here, and then if we take the output physx, set that to mass, it's going to read that down here in the physx shape from mass channel. So those two will talk. And we need an input standard and another input standard. And we need that new event because we only need to calculate it once when the particle is born, because their mass is not going to change because their shape is not going to change. Pipe that in here. That'll take care of evaluating all that only once on event entry, in our case at birth, because we're going to explode at frame 0. If you wanted to explode later or trigger burst something else, just use an H test or any other test and pipe them into a next event or another data operator, whatever, and use an H test with whenever you need your explosion and trigger it there. For the heck of it, I'm just going to do it right now or right when they're born. So we want to go here and go shape, input center shape. We don't want to count the vertices. We want shape volume, scale adjusted. You can use the surface or volume. That'll I always use volume. That'll calculate the volume of each and every of the particles depending on how big they are. And we want to put in a multiplier as well. So it's good to have. So we need a function and a scalar, and we need to set that to real. And we want to multiply that multiplication by a multiplier and pipe the shape in here, and then we can expose that as show data expose. This is gonna be our mass multi for math multiplier. So that's our first exposed value. We can just adjust it without even opening the flow, and we pipe this right here in the mass and fulfill the input. So now if we script through, we should have particles that are as heavy as their volume. So the big ones will fall straight down, and the little smaller ones will have a little more restitution, bumpiness, and such. But that looks pretty good overall. I mean, they have an almost evenly sized, but I just like to have more accuracy, so always use this shape by mass operator. And we're just gonna build the rest of the operator in the very same box 2 operator, because literally this is how our flow is gonna look like. We don't need more than that. We're just gonna build all the rest in here, and it's not even super big. So the first thing we need in order to read stuff from another piece of geometry, our velocity sculpting geosphere, is we need to select object. You always need that if you want to pick stuff from your scene. In our case, it's gonna be geosphere velo sculpting. Now let's do multiple and add that thing in, and it's the next thing we can expose. That is gonna be velo sculpt obj for velocity sculpting. Oop, there's an L missing. Velocity sculpting object, and then you can just pick shapes here without opening the operator again. And we pipe in the new event, because same here, once they read the values from this object, they just gonna find that the set data based on the distance and normal alignment of the sphere, and they only need to know this data once. So we only read that once, new event, and save calculation time. So this thing will only iterate in the first substep when a particle is born. And we want to read the closest point distance, which is the distance from a particle it shoots a ray in its outside of it, in the direction, in the normal direction, and it's going to hit this geosphere at some point. And this value is what we want to read. This is called closest point distance. And for that we need a geometry sub operator, and closest point distance right here is a preset, the distance from a particle to the closest point on the object surface. So it's going to measure all those particles, all those distances. So every particle will have a distance to a point closest to it based on where it is inside this other geosphere. And what else we need is the point normals, because we want to have them flying based on the alignment of the normals of this geosphere too. Like we can throw a gnarly noise modifier on here and make it all crooked, and then our explosion is gonna fly out in the normal direction of this geosphere. So we want to set it to point normal, and we need another pair input. We need closest point by surface, because this particle wants to know a normal closest to the normal that of the face that's closest to it. This particle right here doesn't care what this face on the backside, what normal information it has. It wants to know the normal of the face that's closest to it, pointing right at it. Like this face right here would want the normal information of this face on the geosphere. And so we need another geometry sub up here, and we set closest point by surface. So then it'll shoot a ray out, and the closest face it'll hit, it's gonna be its picked face, and we pipe that here. That's given a pair value. We combine it point normal, and we need the object, because point normal wants to know the point normal of what object at what position on the surface, and obviously every particle wants to know the normal closest to it on the geosphere surface. So what we want to output in the end is an output physics force right here. That's a vector, and if I pipe that in right away right here, we just gonna get the point normal and the force. They fly out in all directions based on the normal. And since this is the geosphere that's round, we have a very hemispherical collision. They collide with the floor right here, because our physics world probably has floor enabled, or I'm pretty sure it does. If not, we do that right now. It has its ground collision plane enabled by default. If I turn that off, it'll just gonna fly through the ground, and then we have a perfectly circular explosion take into account too the size and mass of the particles. Those ones that are flying further out of here are the bit smaller ones. See how the bigger ones are not flying out with that much force? That's because their mass determines their weight, kind of. But we're on the ground collision plane, and so if we throw a noise modifier on here real quick just to test if it's all working yet, let's do 10 again, probably like close to the same values as we had when we created our little guy here. Let's do 25 in the size maybe, and we need more cowbell here on the noise. 20 maybe. Yeah, something that's just more crooked than the three we had before. And you can see how now we have a more crooked explosion based on the normals this geosphere is having outside. This vector is going to be applied as force, and then eventually gravity kicks in and they'll all fall to the floor. If we need more mass, we can just play with the mass multiplier, and that's going to be a lot less because now they're 10 times heavier than they originally are. So if your explosion is going a little wild, just use a different mass multiplier and take care of that way. I keep it at 1 right now because we're not done with that data operator yet. What we want to take into account, that's why we created closest point distance, is not just the normal as a force, but I also want to know how far is this particle away from, let's say, this face right here. And if a particle is far away, I want that to be an indicator that it's going to apply an extra boost of force in the direction of the distance. So normals and distance are going to be our driver for the explosion, because then you have all the power you want to sculpt your explosion. You just add FFTs and pull, make it like a C-star shape, and then you're going to have a C-star shaped explosion, hopefully. So we take this one, and we need another function to connect this to. And we drag that one in here, and our second input needs to be a real value, because this is a real value here, and we pop that into second and this one into first and connect that in. Let's see what we get, and they're all gone because now it gets a little bit too much force, and because right now we take this point normal force that we had and multiply that by the distance, which is in idea what we want to do, because then they get more force where the distance is higher, because obviously if it's further away, see, in the first frame it calculates all the distances. If a particle is further away from the sphere, it's going to multiply that by the point normal, and then they fly further and faster in that direction because that's applied as force. But this is a pretty high value here. We want like a tenth of that, because look at our explosion right here. This is going a bit crazy. They're flying so gradual right now, and kind of like in a streak pattern, because the geospheres, their distance is all very similar. So we need to cut that way down. We can bring that guy over here to keep things a little bit overviewing. There you go. And so we want a post factor of 0.1, 1/10 of what that calculates, and that is a lot better. Not as crazy anymore, but still going pretty wild. So what we want to do is, maybe multiplication is not the right thing we want to do. What I would suggest is to elongate the lengths. So whatever's x is going to be y. In that case, vector 1, the normal, is going to be the input of the distance. Or we can try division, divide those two from another. But that's going to get a super tiny number for us. We show data, if that is applied as force, not much is gonna happen, but multiplication goes pretty wild here, even with a 0.1 value of its force. So what we want to do is we want to invert the value of the closest point distance, and we can easily do that by dividing it by 1. So we need another function. We do 1 minus and then our input. We need a real vector, a real input type and a real input type, and we do subtraction, and we need a scalar set to float, and we pipe the 1 in on the right side, the first input. So we do 1 minus and then closest point, and pipe that back in here. So now if I read what this function gives me, is we get negative values. What that does is I get the distance of a particle to the surface as a negative value times the point normal. So this looks a little better here, but let's do elongate lengths. So it takes the input of the first input and copies it to the second here, and that is looking a lot better. I like that a lot better. It's always worth playing with a different function if you start out with an effect, if you don't have 100% set of what you have to do. So there's one piece going totally crazy. It's probably because some normals here are overlapping each other because the noise is a little crazy. Let's turn that off for a second, and let's turn that off entirely, and let's sculpt us some velocities here to make this guy see-through so you see what we're doing. And use an FFD 4x4 is probably good. And let's start dragging out some pinches here. That one maybe on that side, and a little more on this side, bulging out, and here maybe, something like that, maybe pointing up a little. And let's see what we get, just for the heck of it. You can always set noise back on top, but we probably want to dial that back by a good amount so the faces are not in each other's face. Let's turn that back on and see what we got here. So if we scrub through, you see how all that explodes an awful lot in this direction, because that's where the distance is the highest away from particles to where they hit face on the juice weir. But that's still going a little bit too crazy here. Let's just make sure that this executes first 1 on 1 and this second. And let's see what we can do about the mass. Probably 1.5. It's not too bad. But you can see how they're exploding in this direction. So let's turn that off, put another one on top. 3x3 maybe. This time let's raise the roof here, and maybe just one side. So now they fly higher because the distance and the top direction is higher, and they still fly all in the direction of where we pinched out our little doodle here. And those guys flying in this direction are still flying out a little further because their distance is still bigger than what those guys are facing. The guys here in the back are all having very short distance, so this force, all that overpowers here. If we try that without the 1 minus, show you real quick, you get the opposite. So we need the inverted value of the distance and elongate that by the point normal, and then we get what we want. Right now, if in this setup they're forcing right here, they're banging into the ground and then just skate over the floor. So we need the inverted value of our closest point distance, and then pop that in here, and this is how we sculpted this guy. And let's try that with noise and a little bit more craziness here, and there it goes, more crazy. Some fly more in that direction now because they get normals they would not get when facing straight, and that's how you can give it a nice shaping. And sometimes what you have is, let's turn that off and that off, have a completely gradual explosion. The one top guy flies pretty high because he's probably the furthest distance up there. Because this shape sits on the floor, the particles, where this is in the perfect center. So one guy gets a little crazy over here, and I think let's turn off the wireframe shape so we see just our pretty particles. And you see some of them are still a little like skating, a little itchy, and that happens a lot when there's too much restitution on the floor and too much friction. Let me show you what I'm talking about. We make that 0.5, they're gonna explode and then all bouncy roll over the floor a lot more than I'd like that to happen, because I want it to be heavy rocks. So the restitution should be maybe 0.1, and then still we're gonna get some skating like that dude. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna physics world right here, and down in the advanced parameters, first of all we can add our samples. So all this calculation happens a little more accurate because, let's hide that thing for a second. Alright, because it, depending on what your subsegment is right now, half frame, and in the physics world if I set it to 4, that means 8 times the frame, it's gonna calculate where a particle is and what it does, and that way you get more accurate collisions, etc. Let's see if we take that to 4, if we get a little nicer ground collision. Yep, that's a little better. And some of them might sometimes not rest and just jiggle a little on the floor, and that's because their energy just created from their mass, gravity pulling them down to Earth, but they're already on the floor, which is like a deflector if you want. So the deflector keeps them from falling further down, getting pulled to the world center if you want. The deflector keeps them from that, but the sheer mass of the when it's a bigger object, the sheer mass creates so much energy still that they're gonna jiggle and wiggle around a little, and they're a little uneasy. So what you want to do is you want to play with your sleep threshold. I have that here in the box 2 documentation, always consult that one. And down here is your sleep thresholds, and we want to play with the spin rate and speed. When they are below a certain threshold that we're going to set, they should be excluded from the physics simulation until another particle impacts on them, falls on top of them, and they get a little more impact velocity. Same with the bounciness. Once they tipped a little on the floor and rolled over and such, when their bounce energy, and if you want, is at a certain low enough threshold, we want them to be excluded from the physics simulation. This, by the way, speeds up your simulation too. You want to only simulate as many particles as you need, and if a particle is just laying here like that dude, not doing anything, just exclude him from the simulation for a second until another particle impacts him and he gets initial velocity again. Then he's going to be included in the objects of possible to calculate objects again in physics. So we want to play with spin and speed maybe. So if their speed is below 1, I don't want them to do anything anymore. Spin rate, let's do 10, and bounciness we can leave as is. They're not jumped around because we have a low restitution. Like if I do that back to 5, that's good. So spin, it's 0.1 and 2. A little more bouncy and wiggly. It's still fairly good. That is not even that PhysXplosion. All that is coming from our operator. They're behaving pretty well. And so if I ramp that up even, spin rate of 10, I'll put them to sleep very early on. They wiggle like for a couple of frames and then are just sitting there, solid as a rock if you want, and you won't have any wildly wiggling around ones that eventually penetrate another one and then cause particles to jump up and down and all that. We don't want any of that. This is behaving pretty good for being all nice and jaggedy edges like you want your rock to be. And let's unhide our sculpting sphere again, and let's turn on that guy again, our triangle. Maybe add the noise back in, and let's see what that gives us. We should have particles jumping all the way in that area because that is where it bulges out. And let's rotate that, and let's turn off the noise that seems to distract them wildly here, and just like maybe raise that a little. And you could just model your velocity sculpting object. See, this guy does not bounce at all anymore because our sleep threshold in the world is now so high that he just falls, rolls over, and then sits on on the plane that is on the same level as the physics world floor. So if you have stuff that's falling into mud or something that should just stick, boom, and does nothing anymore, you want to play with those values. If I go that back to 2, then we should have a little more action going on because it doesn't calculate as frequent per subframe. Let's play around with this guy a little more. Let's add maybe, what's a good one? Let's add a greeble, and maybe lower its count overall, something like that. And we don't need the secondary ones, just the primary ones. And let's give them like a 20 height, minimum height of 0, and a taper, no taper. And let's see what that does. Let's give it 100, maybe 50. So this is our greeble impactor geo, and they fly kinda in streaks based on the distance to their because some of the faces are all the way pushed out now out of the sphere. That was a silly idea, but I think you get the point here. Let's try another FFD 4x4. Let's get rid of that, and let's go back to 4, or let's do 6, even a little more sub-segments. Or you can always try different settings, or you don't even need to use a geosphere. Use whatever gets the job done for you. And let's see what we can do. Let's just take those and pull them out. Some here on the floor, maybe. And let's see. Looks like a kidney or something. So let's lower that back down to 1. Now the overall distance is pretty regular, just a little further than this, a little further. Let's make this more extreme here. Let's try that one. So now they shoot out in this general direction, and the one I used here worked pretty good. This starfish kind of shape, and this is how you want to sculpt your velocities. If you sculpt through frame by frame, they clearly fly in that direction, and in that direction, and in that direction. And then when the center goes up too, it goes a little more crazy. Like there you can't distinguish anymore, but in the first few frames they fly here, 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 because you told it so in your velocity sculptor.